A router is a computer. Like any computer, we have to get commands and information into it, as well as getting information back out of it. Let's take a look at some interfaces on some different Cisco routers. This is a Cisco 2514 router. Like all routers, we have to provide a keyboard to type in commands. The console port, located here, allows us to hook up a personal computer or dumb terminal. The keyboard and screen of the computer or terminal become the keyboard and screen of the router. The console port uses a special rollover or console cable to connect from the computer or terminal to the router. Located next to the console port is an auxiliary port marked AUX. The auxiliary port allows us to hook up a modem to the router. If we're not in the same room as the router, we can dial into the modem that's attached to the auxiliary port and enter the username and password that we've set up. We can then type commands into a communications program, such as Windows Hyperterminal, and have them transmitted over the phone lines to the router at the other end. Any information that the router displays in response to these commands is displayed on the screens of the communication program. Great! Now we have a way to communicate with the router. The router is there to do a job, to select the best path to move packets of data on the LAN or WAN.
Here are the Ethernet ports of the router. The 2514 has two Ethernet ports marked AUI0 and AUI1.
Note that there is an LED or light-emitting diode located next to the port. The LED blinks when there is activity on the port. Different routers may have a different number of Ethernet ports. The type of connection the Ethernet port uses is called an Attachment Unit Interface, or AUI. The AUI port allows us to attach a transceiver to it. Ethernet supports many different types of media, including thin coaxial, thick coaxial, 10BASE-T, and fiber optic. By using an AUI, which provides a universal connection, we can accommodate these different media types. We put a transceiver, like this one, on the AUI. If we need to change our media type, we simply change the transceiver rather than having to buy another router. Ethernet is not the only type of LAN technology supported by routers. You can buy routers that support FDDI, token ring, and other architectures. That takes care of the local area network, or LAN connection, so let's look at the WAN connections. The WAN, or Wide Area Network connection, lets the router communicate with the outside world. These WAN connections, or ports, are usually serial connections.
The 2514 has two serial ports labeled Serial 0 and Serial 1, and they're located here next to the console port.
We connect a V.35 cable like this one to the serial port. The other end of this cable is connected to a CSU-DSU, which is, in turn, connected to the service provider's WAN communication line. There are other types of WAN ports available, like ISDN and ATM. Cisco makes routers with these types of connections as well. Let's take a look at another model of Cisco router, the 1600. The 1600 is physically smaller than the 2500 router and is designed to support a smaller number of users. The 1600 has a console port but no auxiliary port. The 1600 has an Ethernet AUI port as well as an Ethernet 10BASE-T port that uses an RJ45 type of connector. Note, however, that both the 10BASE-T port and the AUI port are labeled Ethernet 0. This means that you can only use one or the other type of connector, but not both at the same time. Therefore, this particular model of 1600 router has just one functional Ethernet port at any one time, depending on which type of connection you are using.
Next to it is a serial port marked Serial 0. This uses the same type of V.35 cable to connect to a CSU-DSU.
The 1600 series has a special modular port located here. It's called a WAN interface card, or WIC. The WIC can be purchased in a variety of configurations, including 56 kilobit per second CSU-DSU, T1 CSU-DSU, basic rate interface ISDN, or another serial port. This modular approach, which is also available in the Cisco 1700, 2600, and 3600 series of routers, allows you to upgrade the WAN connection without replacing the entire router. To use the WIC port, remove the protective cover, slide the WIC card in, and secure it in place with the screws. The 1600 and 2500 routers are considered access layer routers. They connect workgroup or departmental LANs to a larger network. Let's take a look at an example of a distribution layer router, the Cisco 4000. It still uses iOS and supports the commands and protocols that you're learning about in your class. Let's take a look at the interfaces on the 4000. Here's the console port. Here's the auxiliary port. This particular Cisco 4000 has 2 high-speed serial interface or HISI ports and 4 Ethernet interfaces. We typically hook the routers at the distribution layer together with faster LAN and WAN connectors than we do at the access layer. At the core layer, we have routers like the Cisco 7000. Core layer routers hook together distribution layer routers. The Cisco 7000 is larger, faster, and has more memory than the 4000, but it has many of the same interfaces. Here's the console port, here's the auxiliary port, and this particular 7000 router has 24 Ethernet interfaces. Now that you've seen a variety of Cisco routers, you can see that they have a lot in common. They all have interfaces that allow us to connect to them, as well as having interfaces for LAN and WAN connections.